Culture, Knowledge and Self-Concept in the Educational Process by Mirela ANGHEL and Nicoleta POPESCU. Abstract. The abstract for our presentation is related to the fact that we discussed the brain structure and how is it shared, that is in two hemispheres, each having its own tools and responsibilities for a proper function of the individual. Studies show that our brain copes differently based on culture, education, geographic location, a background, and many other things. Our presentation has a theoretical approach to the tools that we need to perform educationally. The purpose of the study is to highlight the impact on how culture, self-concept, self-esteem, education influence the individual. Our contribution focuses on the theoretical approach in highlighting the importance of these elements in encompassing a thorough educational process. The knowledge and hemispheres. The left hemispheres of the human brain has traditionally been associated with the following processes: sequential, verbal, auditory, analytical, symbolic, abstract, temporal, rational, digital, logical, theoretical, cause-effect, and linear. The processing of the left hemisphere is systematic. Analysis and planning are strategic points. The problems are solved by looking at the parts, and the succession is critical. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, was associated with the following processes: nonverbal, visual, synthetic, concrete, analogical, emotional, creative, non-temporal, non-rational, spatial, intuitive, tactile, holistic, and global. The processing of the right side follows models and solves problems regarding the overall image. Intuition, faith, and choices are its strengths. The paradox of cultural knowledge asks whether a culture trains individuals to have the right or the left hemisphere dominant, or whether cultures are born with a dominant left or right hemisphere. Two researchers, Springer and Deutsch, solve the paradox by suggesting that every human brain is capable of more than one process, but cultures differ depending on the processes used in different situations. A paradoxical segment of the research suggests that the Japanese brain, for instance, as opposed to the Western brain, function differently. It is suggested that the left hemisphere of the Japanese processes nonverbal human sounds, animal sounds, and instrumental music specific to the Japanese, while the right hemisphere processes Western instrumental music. Previous research claims that all nonverbal sounds were processed in the right hemisphere. It is also argued that the emotional processes of the Westerners are in the right hemisphere and that of the Japanese is in the left. The first language learned develops a person's thinking patterns and influences how the two parts of the brain process language. Western children raised in Japanese culture and language typically acquire Japanese brains and vice versa compared to Japanese children raised in Western cultures. Now, considering the solution of the problem of cognitive styles that illuminated by this article presentation, a model emerges for style and hemisphericity. Hemispheres. Researchers' precautions encourage individuals to apply particular cognitive tools, example, reflectivity or impulsivity, however, unnecessary to exclude the other. For instance, the researcher McCarthy addresses 4 styles of learning and problem solving, each with its own preference, though not exclusively, for the left or right hemisphere. The 4 styles are imaginative, analytical, common sense, and dynamics. The imaginative style approach, right hemisphere, perceives concrete information and processes it reflexively. The analytical approach perceives abstract information and processes it reflexively. The common sense approach integrates theory and practice by perceiving abstract information and immediately applying it to a concrete situation. The dynamic approach perceives concrete information and immediately applies it to a concrete situation. When we talk about culture, hemispheres, and education, we are dealing with the given potential for cultural influence on hemispheric domination and problem-solving models, and it is essential to understand the responsibility of the education system in understanding the effect of developing students' thinking, approach to problem solving, in addition to communication styles. For instance, the researcher Blacksil, in his book, The Genus Datura, argues that the American education system has failed to realize that it is almost unique in teaching students to process information and formulate responses using the accepted skills of the left hemisphere, which is, for instance, linear, analytical, rational, and non-emotional thoughts. The quality of the right hemisphere, often called the hemisphere of the unconsciousness, is not only accentuated, but often associated with something less important or irrelevant. Because we operate in such a sequential world, and because the logic of the thoughts of the left hemisphere is so honored in our culture, we gradually discourage, devalue, and denigrate the power of the right hemisphere. Not that we don't use it at all, it only becomes less available to us because we have established patterns. Blacksil goes so far as to say that it's a decadence in higher education, that it is a natural result of ignorance on the unconscious side of the brain. The system thus feeds itself and becomes more and more scholastic and less intuitive. The culture, it is claimed, that encourages the approach to problem solving seen as more appropriate for certain special situations, where particular cognitive styles may be encouraged, others may be discouraged. Discouraged styles are considered less effective, less appropriate, less responsible. In some cases, special approaches may jump in the face of what the individual labels common sense. Some researchers ask, are the minority students' learning styles different from those of dominant cultures? So, are students' learning styles different from those of dominant cultures? The answer is quite ambiguous. Many researchers suggest that rationalization and problem-solving approaches are encouraged in classrooms. However, the explanation of the different rationalizations and the approach of the problems may differ, each claiming that classroom education strengthens the dominant way of thinking in a particular way. When we refer to the self perspective, we continue talking about educational process, and the researchers at Felder and Silverman claim sustaining that most college students, whether they are regulars or older, need learning methods that require the right part hemisphere of the brain. Unfortunately, Deborah Lieberman says that the information is usually presented through auditory methods or visual representations of auditory information, mathematical words and symbols written in text in the press or on the board. Silverman found that the American students retain 10% of what they read, 26% of what they hear, 30% of what they see, 50% of what they see and hear, 70% of what the professor says, and 90% of what the teacher is saying while doing. Helgeson argues that teachers usually teach in the style in which they were trained, and students try to match the learning styles with that of the teacher. This often leads to learning material in a disorganized manner. Many educators suggest that teachers learn the duality of their students' minds in this regard, stimulating both verbal and nonverbal skills. A recommendation that does not seem very far from the requirements of the Romanian educational system. Now, when we talk about language, we realize that it is so complex that it has become not only an essential feature, but also an object of study, definition, and self-definition. Man speaks to himself or speaks of itself. It enters in communion with others. So communion, it also has the meaning of religious communion, of feeling together. It comes from the Latin word dicere, which means to say, to claim, or to utter. It also means committing, and committing requires perfection. Since Eminescu, things have changed. Our language has become superior in its work, says Constantin Noica, and which is impressive in today's writing. Truth it has become a worker itself, in part due to the consciousness intervention over man. In this exchange of freedoms that took place between man and the universal, man could imagine for a moment that he gave more. You would think the same could happen with the work of language. Man could stimulate it, make it bigger, make it better. But who knows if we ourselves, or anything, we are not anything but mere agents of the truths that have become workers. And if punished within them, we do not ask for their own punishment, because in fact, we mean a simple cry of work in the incomprehensibly of the entire work. This is a quote from Constantin Noica. Unfortunately, it has lost a lot in translation. Its musicality is completely different in Romanian. To continue, we will address what Professor Ilie Bădescu expresses with regards to pragmatic sociology, from which the sociology of action has been risen, interpreted materialistically, and also was brought into an abstract pattern of abstract alterity. The generalized other, who in the view of Mead is the key to birth and maturation of the self, are therefore of the person. Interactional sociology castrates the great chance and its chance, and in the same time its failure. Because after discovering the importance of interaction, in which the personal dimension of power, of dialogue, of communion is restored, it misses the idea, because the person above, which becomes which to whom someone dialogues with, is in a kind of abstraction of the concrete or empirical persons, therefore practical esteem of the collective person, not the very person elevated to his moral power. From the generalized other, says Mead, which is the sum of rules and norms that propagate in all of our manifestation, to the interest network is only one step, and it has been done. In his theory, Mead gave priority to the construction and development of the individual self in society. Social institutions are possible only to the extent that each individual integrated in them can take over the general attitudes of all other individuals and can properly direct their own behavior. The unity of the individual self is conferred by the community of social group, which appears to it in the form of a generalized other. The group experience is internalized and at the same time built. The group offers the possibility of communicating the self with itself and with the others by conveying significant symbols that constitute the logical universe of discourse or the system of universally significant symbols. This universe belongs to groups and is built in situations and interactions. For Mead, the symbol mediates the understanding and communication between individuals in mutual interactions. Interaction is a process in which each person is able to put himself in the place of the other in an imaginary manner by substituting or taking over roles by empathic or intuitive assumptions and anticipations, which regulate the reciprocity of positions. The interaction, thus, appears as a set of strategies through which the rails and the others attempt to each other in order to create a common base of symbols. In this sense, the interaction is symbolic, and the symbolic interactionism highlighted the cognitive aspects of general symbolism, also characterized by Émile Durkheim, Mauss, Claude Lévi-Strauss, and Pierre Bourdieu. Social actions result from the change of symbols within the interactions, taking the form of customs, rituals, rules, in general of institutions. I shall continue to talk about self-esteem, which is an individual estimate of one's worth. Although each seems to be motivated to develop a positive self-image, it has been shown that many people fail and that their self-esteem is low and life can become a desperate and excruciating experience. Self-esteem also increases or decreases in relation to thinking and expressing abilities. And obviously, it has to do with belonging to certain groups, nations, or races. Humanist Jegao, for example, describes the Chinese meaning of the self as another orientation is the key of the interdependent self. According to the notion of the independent self, the Chinese self needs to be recognized, defined, and completed by others. Orienting the self to other needs, desires, and expectations is the development of the Chinese self. In addition, understanding of the family or family self would be further removed from others and its related ties. According to comparative studies between North American and East Asians, the meaning of identity acquires different balances. When asked to describe themselves, North Americans give abstract descriptions such as, I'm good, I'm about to leave, or in the morning I'm calm. While East Asians tend to describe their members and the relationships with others more like as themselves. I am a mother, I'm the youngest child of the family, I'm a member of the tennis club. Jegao contrasts the idea of the American independent self with the Chinese notion of the interdependent self. In the Western world, individual means an independent entity with free will, emotions, and personality. The individual, however, is not conceptualized in this way in the Chinese culture. The incomplete nature of the self is supported by both Taoism and Confucianism, even if they differ in many fundamental ways. Taoism defines it as a part of nature. Together, the self and nature complement each other as a harmonious relationship. The self, in the sense of Confucianism, is defined as the surrounding relationships of a person, which are often derived from the kinship of networks and supported by cultural values such as filial piety, loyalty, dignity, and integrity. According to the notion of interdependent self, the Chinese self needs to be recognized, defined, and completed by others. Orienting the self to other needs, desires, and expectations is the development of the Chinese self. Finally, the self is what founds the metaphysical reality of the individual, constituting the substrate of the ipsiety, or the ontological nucleus of the person. The word Atman denotes at the same time personal identity, as it is expressed mainly in the use of the term instead of the reflexive pronoun in Sanskrit. The dimension of the interior spirituality, the profound and the ontological profoundness on which are grafted characters and individual destinies. In short, the self is the substance of the interior unity. That was our presentation on culture, knowledge, and self-concept in the educational process. Thank you very much for your patience.